Thanks, everybody. Don't go anywhere. We have a second equally engaging panel to come up that's really going to build on a lot of the practical and community-led efforts that were shared on our first panel. I love, and I just want to say thank you to everybody there to hear that. I love how Tony, you talked about how we need to build a culture that includes and celebrates warm care really as a core part of healthy masculinity. That really resonated with me. Farah, the expectation of care work from everybody in the community really is something that I'm going to keep thinking about and cogitating on about how do we shift so that we just have an equal expectation of everybody, and how can we change that in our cultures? The other things that came up from Jake and Yusra was really about meeting men and boys where they're at, both in the spaces that they're occupying digitally and physically, but also in the cultural spaces and backgrounds that they're occupying, and having both literacy and fluency in how to navigate all of those spaces, so that we're having the conversations and the impact that we need to have when and where we need to have it. And the last piece that I think just really came across from everybody, and it just gets back to the work that we're all trying to do, which is really transforming the culture. It's transforming it's desalinating the water, taking out all these invisible barriers that stop us from being able to breathe clearly and all occupy a space with the same levels of dignity. And really what I keep coming back to is violence of any kind against ourselves or others comes from a place of desperation. It comes from a place of not having the ability to rest or to access respite or to access a other solution. It is a refuge of last resort, and we need to be building a world where we force less men into that refuge of last resort, and also where we protect more women and more men from the consequences of that. And there's so much that needs to be changed in this countercultural area. So as we work through that, I'm really thrilled that we're going to be moving into systems change and talking about policy challenges, sustainable solutions at that broader scale, and systems change pieces here. And we always talk about moving the needle. And I hate that because I want to transform, I want a revolution, not an evolution. I think we all feel that impatience. And yet knowing that there's only, one way to do this, and that's one step at a time. So in the next hour, a little less because we've been running a little behind, totally worth it. We're going to explore how long-term meaningful change requires us to look upstream, how to look at the structures and the systems and policies that either enable progress or challenge progress on gender-based violence and equal dignity for all. This amazing panel, the folks you're going to hear from next, they're going to invite us to dig deeper into the really complex conversation that surrounds our existing system, and also advocate for all of us to do this work, and sort of that system that keeps us in silos instead of being able to really move the needle. So my hope is that, and I know from the folks we're going to hear from, that this will encourage us and equip us all to continue to work together to explore policy challenges and identify collaborative pathways towards sustainable solutions to really, really change the system and change our culture. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Yusra, who you've heard from already, but she will be moderating us and taking us through and guiding our next set of guests in this role. Thank you, and thank you in advance to everybody on the panel. We're again so thrilled that you could join us and that you will join us. And folks, I know it's a commitment of time today, but I'm grateful everybody's made it.
Thanks so much, Amy. We've heard a lot across the sector about the importance of prevention, particularly engaging men and boys. But the reality is much of this work still sits in short-term pilots, project-based funding, and isolated initiatives. So this panel, our hope is that we've brought together perspectives across the spectrum So prevention and engaging men and boys, policy and evidence, global advocacy and systems thinking, and the frontline crisis response. And this mix is important because if we're serious about moving the needle, I know, Amy, transformation and revolution would be amazing, but even if we are to move the needle, we need to connect all these pieces. So we're at an interesting moment in Canada and globally. There's growing investment, growing attention, and growing expectations, but we're also seeing very real pressures on systems and a need to be much clearer about what works, what scales, and what is actually changing outcomes. So the question we're joining heads around today is what will it take to move from pockets of promising practice to sustained system level change? So let's dive in. I will invite the panelists to maybe say a couple lines introducing themselves. And can we start with you, Mark?
Hi, Yusra. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. Mark Holjeka, he, him. I live in Toronto, father of three, married to my beautiful wife. I started Shelter Movers in 2016. I'm the founder of Canada's only free and moving and storage service for individuals and families who are fleeing abuse. We've been operating for 10 years now. Nice to meet everybody.
Thanks, Mark. Lana?
Hi, everyone. It's an honor and privilege to follow that last panel, and it's wonderful to be here. My name's Lana Wells. I hold a research chair at the University of Calgary in the Faculty of Social Work, and I'm also a fellow at the School of Public Policy. But I lead a research initiative that is focused for the last 16 years on primary prevention. So the mission is how do we stop violence before it starts? And so we've been focusing on working with all orders of government, designing new primary prevention initiatives as well, which we'll hopefully get some time to talk about, and starting to build cases for not just government, but organizations to shift practice, especially in place-based opportunities, to actually shift the social conditions that are enabling violence. So I'm looking forward to today's panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Lana. Lakshman?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting us here. My name is Lakshman. I'm originally from Nepal, but currently based in Washington, D.C. in the US. I am one of the co-directors of Meninges Global Alliance. So those of you who don't know who we are, Meninges Global Alliance is a network of civil society organizations and individuals across 92 countries right now and around 1,100 members, including in the US and Canada, that are doing work on various spectrums of work, but then with the common interest of how do we really work transformatively on bringing boys and men into the struggle, and what that system, what that framing, what that field should look like. So we are kind of act as a field builder in a way to kind of frame what this work should look like and how the feminist informed work should be about. So we'll be sharing more about that later. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Humberto?
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be with all of you. And what an amazing start already. It was so powerful to hear from everyone. Humberto Carolo, CEO of White Ribbon. I've been with the organization since 2005. I currently sit on the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces External Advisory Council for the Sexual Misconduct Support and Resource Center. And I'm a member of the Ontario Government Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. So my areas of interest are obviously men and masculinities, preventing gender-based violence, and promoting healthy masculinities. Also a father of three, and three boys, young adults now. And what brings me to this work, a lifetime commitment to change my own experiences too, as a boy and a young man, having grown up with violence in my home and watching the women that I love experience that violence both in the home and the community, and having adopted three boys who themselves lost their family of origin to family violence as well. So deep personal, professional commitment to this, and a sure belief that change is possible, especially when we all work together on this. So really honored to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Humberto. It's a privilege to moderate this panel, and I am a personal fan. Like the young people make hearts like this now. So, kudos to all of you for all your work. I'm going to start with you and responding to the first question, Humberto, and then we'll go around. So, there's been many promising GBV prevention initiatives that remain short-term or project-based. What do you think it will take to move from episodic programming to sustained system level investment in engaging men and boys in prevention?
Thank you for that question. It's very clear, even from the previous dialogue, that so much more needs to be done, right? And we continue to operate our engaging men and boys programs in small scale, in these little pockets of little small programs, pilot projects, right? That if we're lucky, we'll get some funding to run for 2 years. And my goodness, if it's 3 years, we jump up and down in celebration. But you know what? Guess what? Once those programs end at 3 years, we're asked to do something else different, go into another community, partner with other organizations. So how in the world are we supposed to give sustainability and continuation to this program and demonstrate its effectiveness on the long term? So we need a different systems of investment, not just by government, but also by the private sector, right? We need to step outside of these silos. All of this work usually fits within, federal programs like Women and Gender Equality, or the Office of Women's Social and Economic Development in Ontario in particular. We're all accustomed to, when we raise, there's a, we should address this within the context of health or mental health, or look at prevention with engaging men and boys in sports. We're always sent back, to these very siloed, very specific areas of funding and support. And so we're very limited in the kind of change that we can create, and we're limited in the funding, in the timelines, and all of this. So we need a bit of a revolution in how this work is invested in, supported, not just in terms of prevention, but even in terms of like supporting survivors. There's so many gaps. There's so many folks, survivors, and also men who perpetrate violence, who fall through the cracks, who could have benefited from interventions much earlier on, going back to their younger years even. Yet we continue to be forced to sort of fit our approaches, our initiatives into these little narrow pathways that only take us so far. So you've heard the calls to action from the previous speakers, and you're going to hear from those of us around the screen today. But that a different framework is needed, and there is a role for all to play: government, institutions, private sector, donors, philanthropists, all of them, not just in Canada but around the globe.
Thanks, Humberto. I love that your tagline at the end matches your background. We all play a role. With that, I'm going to go to you, Lana.
Great, and thank you. And I'm probably going to reiterate what Humberto said, but I think there needs to be 4 key shifts. And first, we actually need to reframe prevention as core infrastructure. So it's actually an essential service, and everybody's shaking their head. And that means it's a public safety issue. It's not a private issue, and it has to come from a whole government approach. And I actually don't think a lot of it belongs in Women and Gender Equality or the Ministry of Status of Women. It belongs outside everywhere else. And so I think, when we think about, we don't pilot roads, right? We build and maintain them. Prevention has to be the same mindset. It needs to be embedded in how our systems function across policing, as mentioned, workplaces, education, philanthropy, communities. And so it should not be an add-on. And when you analyze funding across all the provinces, territories, in the nation, there's very little going towards primary prevention or even early intervention, right? And so again, I think framing it as an essential services, which means we need to build cases. So the second thing we've been doing is using economic evidence to shift policy decisions on prevention. And recently, I just released a report through the School of Public Policy with several other economists and psychologists. And it takes all of us to, think about these issues and build economic cases. But we found that a relatively small investment, early intervention. So lots of, this is a particular police data set where we're looking at men who get charged with domestic violence. And in about 70% of cases, men had had a domestic violence encounter. That meant police showed up, but they worked on victim safety plan. They didn't do anything with him. So we're arguing if you were to do behavior approaches and even support these men, which in Calgary would be like a $1.2 million investment, you'd actually save $100 million if you reduced the charges even by 40%. I took a very conservative estimate. But again, building that case, and I'll plug it into the chat box, it costs, and the studies called it costs more to do nothing. But again, I think we have to build these economic cases. I teach in social work, and I was just teaching a class last night around policy, and they have a lot of policy changes and asks, but we often don't put the economic costs, and where's that money going to come from? So I think we have to get better at that and building that kind of skill set to go with our asks. And then the third is really directed at policymakers and funders. So if there's any policymakers and funders on the call today, we have to move away from short-term funding cycles. And we have examples like Australia and others where they are making 10-year commitments, 5-year commitments of cycle. We know what it takes to do an R&D. R&D could take 7 years sometimes. And then the scale and implementation, when you think of initiatives like the 4th R, my good friend, Dr. Claire Crooks, may she rest, who designed these initiatives, it took 15 years of investment and support, and then the ongoing to ensure that the sustainability and scalability happens. So I just think we need a longer term commitments. We need government in it for this long term. And we need to be funding the cycles of building, designing, implementation, scaling, replicability, and then making sure it actually makes sense at that local level.
Thanks, Lana. What I'm hearing is 1 step forward, 2 steps behind doesn't work, and it sets us back, and it does more harm than it does good. I'm going to move to you, Lakshman.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think, also we need to plug in, what came out of the earlier panel was also that the reason why issues of gender equality or feminism are not a priority for anyone sitting in the positions of power, why that happens, we need to also understand the fact that these are men or people who have been socialized to understand what gender means and whether they prioritize gender equality at all or not. And their level of understanding of what gender equality can contribute in whatever they are thinking or doing, and also what it means for their own lives, right? So I think it boils down to also the issue of lack of clarity, or I would say wrong interpretation of what gender equality even means. To see if we say that gender equality, to unpack as first panel did, to say that gender equality is not just a zero-sum game, it's benefits for everyone. There's last benefit, as Lana, you are just sharing about. So I think we need to make that case that gender equality is a very important issue for everything else we are trying to do, and make a case for it requires enough attention and financing to make things happen. And then also we need to clarify that gender equality is not only a women's issue, it's everyone's issue, and make it as not a charitable thing, but rather a human rights issue, right? So that, I think, framing has sometimes worked, sometimes not. But I think, again, the placing it not as a charity issue becomes really, really important from an agency and human rights point of view. And I think it requires a lot of us also to then engage with people in positions of power. So one of the things that we are realizing, and we are developing a methodology called working with men in positions of power right now. And how do we help men and boys, particularly men, because they are the ones that sit in the decision making of every institution, the number of institutions at a state level, or let alone the whole conversation of state as a patriarchal institution in itself. So that also requires some level of thinking and critical analysis. But then also to start with that, if we can engage with people, and particularly men in positions of power, in a meaningful way, there is a likelihood of willingness to allocate and prioritize this agenda more. So also, as much as we work at the community level, and also it's important to work at that level as well, so that there is a comprehensive, holistic approach in the work we do across the life cycle as well. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Lakshman. It makes a lot of sense stripping away the jargon and really talking about the tangibles and how they work with men and boys in communities and having sort of a holistic approach that really does embed across sectors and across programs, it makes a lot of sense. Mark, I love that you're on this panel because we're talking a lot about prevention, and it's not that the funding streams of crisis response and prevention needs to be pitted against each other. Both are incredibly necessary and critical. So I really want to see what your perspectives are on short-term fundings and pilots.
Yeah, thanks, Yusra. Yeah, when we were preparing, I think, for the discussion, we talked about, or I was sort of offering this idea of the dichotomy, the simplistic dichotomy of prevention and response, and how that really kind of oversimplifies the complexity of what we're trying to look at. And if we're trying to take a survivor-centered approach, we're asking ourselves, what steps is she going through? Are they going through along that journey from the little girl onto, sadly, to experiencing a form of violence or a form of abuse, and all those steps in between, the complexities of that and the intersectionality of all of that. And then we add how we raise our men and boys and the influence of that on the patriarchy and this big, broad system. And I think we can easily, or I can easily, get lost in those discussions very quickly. My organization, for background, is a very practical, very on-the-ground service. It's, as I said, a free moving and free storage service. It's a charitable organization. But I think what's germane to our discussion is that it engages all genders in the solution. And it's a very practical, measurable, tangible service where particularly men can be involved in a very useful way. And it informs a very healthy form of masculinity, in my opinion, where we're centered on the needs of the people we serve. And it's a masculinity of service and compassion and understanding and humility. And those kinds of qualities and behaviors are not being taught in an academic way, and they're not being provided with lengthy, in-depth economic studies, although those are critical tools to persuade people. But at Shelter Movers, we apply very hands-on approach to changing the hearts and minds of regular people. And I think to Laxman's point, if prevention was valued by the people at the top, it would get more funding. So the question for me is, what is persuasive to the people in decision-making positions? And to Lana's point, I would love to see, not putting anyone on the spot, I'd love to see if there are any major decision makers on this call today, or are we in an echo chamber of educated, thoughtful people all telling each other points that we can all nod our heads to. I think the evidence of my service that when I'm attempting to persuade people to give long-term funding is don't judge me by our activities, judge me by the impact. And services like Shelter Movers are I think easier to measure, and I think it's difficult for us. Although I take Alana's point that we can with econometric analysis predict the benefits of prevention in the long term. That is persuasive to some, not to everyone, and so that is one of many persuasive tools we can use as we attempt to change the culture of our country from the top down or from the bottom up, however you want to do it. So we have that is one of our many tools for persuading people. When I talk about long-term funding, when I talk to potential funders, Shelter Movers we were well aware that we had no interest in pitting ourselves against our sister agencies, women's shelters, sexual assault, victim services we're all fighting for the same pie. I came from oil and gas. I mean, we had hundreds of millions of dollars that we had to spend or heads would roll by the end of the fiscal year. And here I am trying to rub two pennies together, running this charity as best I can, in this completely different world where we're all pitted against each other for the same funding from wage and or other groups. So I said, enough of that. We will have to go for some of that funding, but there are pockets of funding in society that are sustainable, long-term, not transactional, but relationship-based, from sectors that are not normally approached. So what did we do? We went to security companies, private storage companies, vehicle rental companies, all these kind of obscure, like secondary, non-gender-based violence sector businesses. And I called them in and I said, and I had the advantage of being a white straight guy where I could say, other white straight men, this is your chance to show where you stand on this issue. And I'm not calling them out and I'm not vilifying them. I'm saying, I've got this idea. I want to help people in real time. We're going to prevent violence by helping these families flee before it gets even worse. Tell me how this is not important to you. Please try to have that honest discussion with other guys to say, this is a chance for us to come together and be useful. and be of service and stop violence before it starts, or if it did happen, at least intervene and try to cut off as quickly as we can under the direction of our clients. And so while I agree short-term funding is not helpful, I guess I would just, to add a little spice to our discussion, I would offer the thought that government has a role, and I don't think anyone's saying government is the only provider of support. But over the last decade, I can tell you, I've had reasonable success actually telling our story to a number of different sectors, private businesses, families, individuals, and calling them into the solution, because we're trying to change hundreds of years of indoctrinated behaviors. And I mean, this is a tough problem to solve. And I think everyone really does. It's not a tagline. We all have a role to play on Humberto's screen. We literally must all play a role in this, and therefore the tools we use to persuade each different group that they have a role to play will not always be the same. And so listening to the fears and the motivators of those we approach, and then tailoring our persuasive strategy to meet those, to me, has been a successful way of getting funding that is good for many, many years. I'm not saying we're rolling in it, but it's this little things in my basement's 10 years old and 10,000 moves, and I think there's evidence that we were able to make it work and make it work into the future. So yeah, I'm rambling a little bit now, but I think that to the prevention issue, I think there's an opportunity to call in more groups than the traditional players who would fund all of our work.
Thanks, Mark. Really useful insights. I also think there's a slight nuance in how do we measure prevention work, because it takes time. Like, it has to be a longitudinal measurement, and we don't find policies, politics, or money consistent across that longitudinal timeline to be able to demonstrate that. When I had my prep call with Mark, Mark's like, we got this funding, and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking I need another zero in front of it. And within the social profit sector, or the nonprofit sector, as we call it, we don't usually wear those hats where we look at it and say, like, I want another zero. We're usually like, okay, how do I make this work? So I think it's very incredible, insight, and it's coming from oil and gas, Mark. So we appreciate that, and that's why the cross-sectoral fertilization is so important, because sometimes it's us who settle for less, like, work needs to be done. So furthering the strand, why, like, how do we get that persuasion? How do we prove that value for the prevention work that we are doing? The next question is, how can policymakers and funders ensure accountability? So what is it in terms of tangible empirical impact that we can show to funders and policymakers that would lead to measurable systems change in terms of investments growing in GBV prevention? And I think I'll start with you this time, Lana.
Sure, and thank you. I think I'm going to start with an example of work that we're doing. A few years ago, we turned to working in rural and small town Alberta, so we could help communities and support communities through their GBV leaders to surface patterns of perpetration and understand the social conditions that are enabling those forms of violence, and working with and through those who lead those communities and have influence over those social conditions. And I'll give you a quick example with Banff, the town of Banff. So there's about 10,000 people that live there, 4 million visitors a year, and it has 61% of the workforce is in tourism. And the example there is we went to the employers because it made most sense of who needs to be in it. And we also first started with RCMP data and saw, well, very little people are actually reporting. We then went to women's shelter data, very little. So then we said, oh, it's in the workplace. And the workplaces came to us and said, there's violence happening in our workplace. So together we designed a way to collect that data, to make sense of that data. And right now we have 3 employers providing that data. We have another 8 that are hopefully going to come in. But what that has done is actually surface what are the problems, what are the patterns of perpetration, who is harming who and in what ways. And then, because it's happening in the workplaces, we have the private sector who's in for the strategies and solutions. So we're co-designing with them and benchmarking what are the changes we want to see in the community. And so I pull on that example because I've worked a lot provincially or federally or internationally, and we don't have great benchmarks in this area. We don't have good surveillance data in this area, and often it's based on victimization data. And for the last 5 years, we've been really I'm working with police data sets, women's shelters data sets now to really surface what are the perpetrator profiles, what are the patterns of perpetration, where can we intervene, not just early intervention, but then moving into primary prevention. And I'm finding that what's so important is that local level data, because Stats Canada or other data that's coming in, even provincially, doesn't speak to people at the local level. And when we think about what's happening right now, I really believe the change is going to be in community, from community, led by community, and it needs to be. And so I think pulling that together is one point. The other thing I would say is we're not measuring the right stuff because we're not focused on where the problem is. And predominantly, we're talking about male perpetration of violence. We have very little data in that area. And I think we're trying to fill that space right now, not just locally, but leveraging whatever data sets we have right now in Alberta and working with. So the one other example, and then I'll go on, but we are looking at women's shelters data. So they use danger assessments when they come in, and we're having the victim's perspective of the person who's harming them and better understanding who's harming them. So we're adding some questions into that. So we're able to collect that localized data from the shelter, from the survivor perspective, and then together we'll be working with community to support where prevention has to happen. Because we know in all these different communities, the social conditions are different. Right? Who's leading those communities are different. So in our southern part, it's more faith leadership because a lot more people are involved in the faith, where in Banff, it's tourism. So just, I think that localized understanding, supporting that local understanding of perpetration patterns and figuring out what are the changes we want to see and getting better benchmarks and then time, of course, to make the changes with our collaborators.
Thanks so much, Lana. Context really, really definitely matters, and it can make or break what we're doing. And empirical data, I think it's more important than ever. That's the only way interventions will be funded or sustained. Humberto, your thoughts?
Yeah, just building on what Lana mentions, prevention is definitely difficult to measure. And we certainly have had our struggles doing that because in the context of time limited, small scale, project funding, it's very difficult to convince funders to attach strong evaluation components. Again, this is another area where I think significant change is needed. And when we do receive those funds to attach a strong evaluation aspect to the work, we jump up and down, but it shouldn't be like that. It's I think the majority of funders see a sort of evaluation as in a siloed kind of way, whereas we should be doing this kind of work together. So community-based organizations working together with organizations like Lana's, in academia and so forth, and building on each other's strengths and connections and areas of expertise, and attach that kind of longitudinal approach to measuring impact. So if we are rolling out programming with young people, with young men and boys, why shouldn't we follow them along to see how the education that we provided, the engagement that we provided has an impact further downstream? We see lots of anecdotal examples of how that is. We have a couple of folks on our board of directors who benefited from our programming, in their high school years, and this was some decades ago, right? And I'm sure there's hundreds, there's thousands of examples like that, but that has to do with the fact that we're not able to follow those folks along the way, and we're not able to demonstrate impact. So how do we do this? Again, funding is the answer. Partnerships, de-siloing the work, and looking more closely at the data, looking more closely at what happens when boys and young men don't get exposed to this kind of programming. Sitting where I sit at the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, when I review the social histories of perpetrators and victims of the most lethal, of violence, of intimate partner violence, femicides and homicides, often murder suicides as well, I see the lack of intervention along the way. Dating, depending on the investigative details that are provided in these cases that we review, you often see going right back to that young person's behaviors and disconnects and lack of support and significant mental health issues that were experienced in their earlier life, often having experienced and witnessed domestic violence, family violence as well, having engaged in high risk behaviors, sometimes sexual harassment, sexual violence earlier in their young trajectory, and then seeing that reflected, that sort of escalating over time, and seeing the impact of that on their on their spouses, on their children, on themselves. It's heartbreaking, and we need to dig deeper, do the kind of research that Lana is talking about, looking at what goes wrong, in these cases, what are the gaps, what were the opportunities, the missed opportunities along the way where we could have intervened better and differently and prevented the escalation of this violence. So we got to bring that to funders and say, look, here's the stats. Recently, just very quickly, and I'll finish. Stats Canada just released the latest statistics on the impact of online sexual exploitation on girls and young women, I think yesterday or a couple of days ago. And we see the disproportionate impact on girls and young women when it comes to child sexual exploitation. And you know that the only difference where that is reversed is in sextortion, in that the vast majority of youth who call cybertip for support are young men, 83% of them, as opposed to the vast majority of youth who experience sextortion who report to police are young women. So why the difference? Why the difference? And the researchers are pointing to the likelihood that the harmful norms, the norms that teach boys and young men to keep going, to feel ashamed, to not necessarily seek help when something like this happens to them, that those kinds of harmful social norms, gender stereotypes are preventing young men from reaching out for help. We got to look at data like that and say, this kind of work is important. We have to do it because look at how this is then represented in today's statistics in relation to technology facilitated harms, online harms, and how it impacts young women and girls and young men and boys differently. We gotta dig deeper into these issues and apply a stronger gender-based analysis into these stats, and then bring it forward to policymakers and say, this is a significant gap. This needs to be addressed. And this is where the kind of work in primary prevention, promoting healthy masculinities, engaging men and boys, the kind of work that we all do, then becomes really important and really crucial and necessary.
Thanks, Humberto. And as you're talking, I'm thinking there's people here on the call who have programs that don't cost that much, and they are early intervention, sometimes in primary prevention, and they can't find the $10,000 or the $20,000 to run those programs. So if there's wisdom around the room, or if there's policymakers who'd like to put into the chat, what would they like to see measured, which organizations can, package up nicely within their capacity bundles that they have to really persuade or really increase the value of prevention at the policy level. Please feel free to put things in the chat. Mark, I'll come to you because of your successful experience in mobilizing and bringing other actors to the table. What do you think could be things that can be measured to increase the value of prevention?
Yeah, thanks. The risk of being a bit of a broken record, I really, in my previous work, I was in government relations. And so my job really was to, again, find the levers of motivation for policymakers and decision makers and funders to act. And so sometimes the right study, depending on the person I was speaking to, was research and data and policy-driven, survivor-led and informed recommendations. Sometimes they didn't want to hear anything about that. It did not matter to them on issues that mattered deeply to me. And it was very difficult for me to accept that fact when I was coming to them for funding, that they did not, they're the people who elect them or the people to whom they report did not need more data to be convinced. They already knew the need was there and they believed in my work. My job as a persuader was to put what I thought was important aside and to really, really listen to what was important to them. I wish it was more of my policy data, more of my research, and more of my empirical evidence. It often simply was not. Often it was me understanding what was happening in their riding and applying a pragmatic approach to persuading funders. And that's government. Let's talk private sector. Let's talk a family office. Wealthy families, big private money in Canada. And what mattered to them? What mattered to them was that the father had done something he was embarrassed about earlier in his life. And he was ashamed of that, and he never really resolved it. And it was disclosed to me that the father was worried that funding my organization might reveal something that about his past that he wasn't comfortable with. And so now I'm not thinking about the data, the longitudinal data I've collected about the children and the positive impacts that come from reducing exposure to violence at a young age to children. Now I'm thinking about how do I help this person manage his professional reputation so that he can unlock those dollars that he wants to give me, but he's afraid to. And so all that data, all the information I gathered was not going to help me in that situation. It was all about helping the family manage their reputation so they could make a big donation. So I'm repeating myself and I apologize for that, but I really do urge a very pragmatic approach. And it means we need all of these different tools available to us when we come to people, but preparing ourselves as we approach someone for funding to do that research long in advance and deep research. When I'm looking for money from a private source, I want to know everything about it's. I'm not to be creepy, but I want to know everything about their personal life, their business investments, who they gave to before, all the things, so that when I come in, I don't misspeak, right? And so my cause or any of our causes is very worthy of funding. When it comes to government specifically, I always recommend that dual approach. You don't want the bureaucrats to be surprised by the political staff, and you definitely don't want the political staff surprised or educated on something that by the bureaucrats. So I do my research on which ministry I'm going after in whatever jurisdiction. I identify the elected officials. I never reach for the elected officials first. You always go for chief of staff or the stakeholder relations person in their office. And you contact, and before I contact them, I do my research on who it is I'm about to contact. And then I'm looking for who in the ministry is the ADM or the director general of that particular, all that stuff that no one sees in advance. When you walk in, I don't put my foot in my mouth too badly. I still do, even after doing all that research, I still sometimes say the wrong thing, or I come off as too aggressive or whatever in my style of communication. And being a white cis male working in largely in a sector where women are largely the ones who work there, and I represent nearly all female staff, I'm very mindful of how I present myself and all those bits of self-awareness that I'm still working on myself. I think those are the ingredients that go into us persuading those with power and money that they need to understand why our causes are so critical and why we're going to save lives and change our culture together, not necessarily today, but within the next 5 to 10 years, which, by the way, is outside of their next election cycle. So the discussion may not, there's a reason why funding cycles are 3 to 4 years, in my humble opinion. And while I do believe in constantly, I want to prove to the people who invest in my service that my service is worthy of their money. So I don't believe in perpetual funding. I don't think that's actually healthy. 5-10 year cycles, I think, is probably a good thing with regular check-ins and accountability for what we do is a reasonable and healthy thing to keep everybody honest and showing why our service is worthy. So a few points there to spice our exchange here.
Thanks, Mark. It's become very spicy with the election cycles and all the information. Thank you so much. Really practical insights.
I probably burned some. I hope I don't have political staff on this call, because I probably just burned a bunch of bridges by doing that. But I know.
Thanks, Mark. I'm moving to you, Lakshman. What do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about it. So I think I will go into different directions now, maybe just to provoke a bit more of a thinking as well. So when we talk about evidence, all sort of arguments, I think first we need to understand that the log frames don't determine or define evidence at all. The log frames approach or the evaluation approaches that we have been applying so far as heavily Eurocentric, colonial, and academic oriented, and quantitative. These don't tell stories that people want to hear, right? So we need to be really just for numbers only, don't tell what really the change should look like. One. Second is, if you look at it from a bit more of a power analysis point of view, whose stories get to become evidence and who decides that? It's also all about power. So we really need to be careful about sort of perpetuating the same power dynamics in the sense of that we are trying to dismantle, but then feeding into the same by sort of feeding into the same hierarchy of what counts evidence and what doesn't, right? So we also need to think outside of the box of this traditional approaches to evaluation and evidence building, and again, to the level of what counts evidence and what does not, whose voices are listened to and which stories are not even listened to. All of that needs to be really, really factored in as well. So that's the second one. Third is, if we really look at evidence and the conversations about the change, we have started using the frame of theorizing the change, not to come with predetermined ideas of what change should look like. That has been a major destructive factor for many of the programs, but rather come with open with some ideas of what change you want to foresee, but then look at how the society wants to change itself and what really works in the society. Use that as the base of knowledge that we are then using forward, rather than you already coming with these preconceived ideas of what evidence am I looking for, and only looking at that will not give you the whole picture. Otherwise, we'll boxing the lives of people as well. Third is also the fact that when we look at using evidence for advocacy for more fundraising, I think we need to also be careful about, as building on to what Mark said earlier, there is a tension within the feminist movement of the money going to the work with boys and men and versus the work for traditional women's empowerment work. And what we are not saying is that the work with boys and men or the effort should not be pitched one or versus the other. And that's what the donors are doing right now. And that's how the systems of power have always been operating and playing with us and divide and rule option, right? So, and we need to be careful. And at the same time, also we need to be careful about this superficial work that is taking place with boys and men, and that are getting a lot of traction right now. For example, sorry if some of you are associated with that, but the He for She campaign, for example, is not a very good example of what a transformative work with boys and men should look like. And I think there is a tendency where this kind of very superficial and easygoing work are getting more and more traction and funded, rather than actually funding very transformative work that Mark or Humberto or Lana and other colleagues earlier have been saying. And I think the transformative work is not what is really funded. The anti-rights MRAs groups work with men and boys is heavily funded. And I think we need to be careful about some of those elements as well. And then also, when we look at evidence, what we have seen in the field so far is that we have seen very small levels of individual behavior change evidence when it comes to the work with boys and men. For example, the whole conversation of fatherhood. Yes, everyone, men can be fathers, but not all men become father at the first place. Second, men are not only fathers, they are policymakers, they are power holders, they are head of institutions, they are politicians, and so on. You name it, all the institutions, that's where the men are. So for me, then fatherhood is an entry point. But I think if we get stuck on how can I be a good father, but not at the same time, what needs to be happening with me if I need to be a good partner at my home, I'm a good man out there in my community with gender transformative mindset and so on. So we have to look at it from a systems perspective as well. So for me, when someone comes and says, oh, we have got 50% of men who are involved in fatherhood clubs are now transformed from where they were, that is not an evidence to showcase where the transformative agenda or the vision of advancing gender equality is coming from, because just becoming good father And at the same time, the same person can be extremely bad husband. And that doesn't match to what we are looking at when it comes to the work with boys and men. So how do we bring that transformation as a journey on in itself and look at evidence and build the case for that as well becomes important, and that used in the policy making as well. And then policies, again, should not be siloed, right? For example, very quickly, last point is that now there is a hype of developing national strategies on working with boys and men. And we have been saying that's not really the goal, where in the context, I'm from South Asia, many of our countries don't even have gender equality policy. And now suddenly governments are jumping on, oh, we need to have policy on engaging boys and men. And to me, that is what exactly patriarchy does. Centers the interest and focuses men's experience than what the vision of gender equality is all about. So for me, all of that gets tied as well, and some of the cautions as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lakshman. It's really important to talk about the tension, and Amy has put in a comment in the chat, which I absolutely agree with. I'm going to flip the last question as just like, a 40-second last message for everybody here. And it takes root in this tension. So many times a work that centers men and boys, it can be met with skepticism and it can be misunderstood. So tangibly, if each of you could just spend 30 seconds, 40 seconds and say something about how can we tangibly make efforts, or what can we do to make sure that this doesn't sound or is presented as something that's competing with broader gender equality efforts, but as a part and parcel, a critical one of the work that we need to move the needle. I'll start with you, Lakshman.
Oh, so for me, I think it gets connected. We need to, whether at individual level or institutional level or policy level, the first and foremost is we need to broaden the definition of gender as a term. That has been a problem for many, many years, and particularly the way the term gender has been misused and misunderstood by many, to say that men and boys are also gendered beings. We are gendered people as much as everyone else are. So if we really have that framing and understanding and the understanding of the problem, I think that will be a very good start.
Thanks so much. Love you stuck to the time, 40 seconds, Humberto.
Yeah, for me, it's breaking the silos, the silos of funding, the silos of partnership. We got to do this together with women, with 2S LGBTQI folks. We got to apply an intersectional approach. We got to remember our colonial and racist past, and we got to accept the impacts of those forms of discrimination on people's lives. We got to work on healing. Yes, we got to work on prevention. We got to build allyship and encourage men to stand shoulder to shoulder, side by side, with everyone who's working towards gender equality and social justice. Yes, we got to accept this as our role. All of that and much more, but also continue with the conviction that change is possible and is needed. And that in itself gives me hope. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Humberto. Mark?
I think we need to take a very pragmatic approach, as I've said a few times already, and I think we need to show men and boys that there is social cachet and there is deep value in healthy masculinity, and providing really tangible examples of how behaviors and habits will still end with them feeling loved and being respected and loved by others, and draw them towards a version of masculinity that is positive and doesn't discount accountability, but shows them that life is great when you want to be a better man, and dominance and all these man box nonsense that men have been forced to live in is actually less attractive than a healthy masculinity of compassion and humility. I share Humberto's optimism. As you saw, the Femicide Observatory reports on the number of murders of women and girls, and 2025 levels were back to pre-pandemic 2018 levels. It's been rising consistently 2018. I think that's evidence that our work is ideally, we can't make that causal link, but I think we can draw a gentle conclusion that our work is having a positive impact. 0 is the number, obviously, that we need to reach, but the 1 year is also not a trend. Anyway, I still am encouraged by the evidence that femicides are going down, hopefully, and will remain that way in the future.
Thanks so much, Mark. You're right. Even one life, it's too many. Lana?
I think it would just end on we need to frame men as part of the solution, not the problem. And the flip is so critical. And I think about individual men in terms of building skills, creating accountability, and of course, expanding pro-social norms and shifting norms. But individual change is not enough. We need to shift workplace cultures, community expectations, institutional responses so that prevention is reinforced consistently across all different silos, sectors, places that we live. And so I think that, yeah, I would leave you with that.
Thanks so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for the amazing insights. It's been a really thoughtful and grounded discussion. What I'm taking away is that we don't have a shortage of ideas or even promising models. What we're grappling with is consistency, scale, and alignment. And as the panelists highlighted, how do we move from pilots to systems, from activities to impact, and from intention to measurable change? We have heard clearly that engaging men and boys, it's not a side conversation. It's not on the periphery of the agenda. It is the agenda, and caregiving work needs to be dealt with as part of essential infrastructure in the work that we're doing. And for all that to hold, it has to be like, Mark talked about work being properly resourced. Lana, you talked about being held to clear outcomes and working with data that would tell the story. And Humberto and Lakshman, you talked about positioning in a way that strengthens the overall equality, gender equality agenda. And perhaps more importantly, everybody said it, that this work cannot sit in silos. So prevention, policy, and response have to all be connected. Otherwise, we will stay in cycles of reacting rather than shifting conditions. So what I've heard today, which I'm deeply inspired from, is that if we're serious about moving the needle, then the question is not whether good programs exist. We know that they do. The question is whether there is going to be investment in them. What can we do to make that happen? How do we measure them, and how do we sustain them long enough to actually change the system and show impact? So I really want to convey a heartfelt thank you to all the panelists and everybody who's joined us today for your presence, for your time. Time is the most precious commodity we have. So we're deeply thankful on behalf of Mothers Matter Canada. Please stay in touch. All the resources, information, and contact information for the panelists has been in the chat. And have a lovely rest of the day and stay in touch.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.